veganism is not just a diet, it's a revolutionary way of living. It is completely antithetical to recorded history. It is something very radical, and I had to be honest with myself in deciding that I'm not going to live as a radical, I'm not going to live as a revolutionary. I want to say that I completely agree with the vegan message. I have no issues with the diet nutritionally or practically. It's a perfectly fine way to live. I was a vegan for almost 4 years, and it's not hard, it's not difficult. But I got into veganism because I thought it was the thing to do if you want to change the world for the better environmentally. And the reason I stopped is because it wasn't the diet itself, nutritionally, but the diet socially. The future challenges I would face in finding a wife who was vegan, in raising children as vegans, all the conflict that would occur because of that I would have to make because of my commitment to veganism, it became very unappealing. And then when I thought about that, the prospect of living as an activist for this cause, I realized I didn't want to spend my life that way. I don't think people in general are evil. I think people just follow the trends, follow the traditions of their culture, of their society. And I include myself, obviously, in that category. Over time, as you go on being a vegan in your life, over time it will socially make you crazy. It'll make you hate everyone around you. It'll make you hate your country and the way people just don't care about anything that you care about. Everywhere you go, every restaurant you go to, every friend's house you go to, unless they happen to be vegan, it will all be full of stuff that you find morally reprehensible. And you will think terrible things about the people that you come into contact with. You'll think terrible things about your siblings and your parents and your grandparents, everything. I am choosing to live, I'm choosing to do as Romans do as Americans, as Westerners, as really every population does, for maybe a few minority populations in India who live strictly vegetarian. Living as a vegan is a sign of advanced morality, of incredible attention to detail and incredible attention to, lives that people really don't consider to be worth anything. The lives of cows, chickens, and pigs, or whatever. But I do view veganism as basically doomed. So yeah, I didn't want to live for a lifestyle or a movement that I thought was doomed, and so I stopped. I am consciously rejecting veganism and its ideas because I think it is doomed, because I don't care much for symbolic moral victories. And it's like something you do when you're enthusiastic about the prospect for change in that respect. When it comes to the environment, animal welfare, stuff like that. But as the years went on, it just became clear that this was not anything more than a symbolic gesture. And I'm not one for symbolic gestures. I want concrete change in the world, not just one guy, you know, living in his own eccentric way by refusing to eat meat, dairy, eggs, etc.
We talk about suffering in a very strange way in our culture in this area. When you say suffering, the first image that comes to mind is probably torture, interrogation. And then maybe the secondary meaning of the word is a somewhat snide and insincere use in a certain kind of turn of phrase like suffering for his art, you know? The pursuit of political change involves suffering, and not just a little bit of suffering. And guys, I rarely talk about the history of science or the philosophy of science on this channel, but in its way, scientific progress, technological progress. If you read the biographies and autobiographies of the men and women who made it happen, you'll start to appreciate that it involves suffering as well. In a very sincere sense, scientists and researchers, they also are people who have to suffer for their art. When you look at the vegan movement as it is today, and then you look at the history of different movements that have sought, each in their own way, to fundamentally and profoundly change the world, to ethically and politically transform the daily norm for the human race. What I have to ask you is, who has suffered less? And yet, when you think of suffering, you may immediately think of war, explosions, torture, physically real suffering in obvious ways. Well, you know what? When you think about the abolition of slavery, some people were members of a movement. Some people were members of a salon. Some people were members of a lobbying committee. They worked with lawyers and lobbyists in our terms, And some people were all alone. There's a different kind of suffering in that isolation. Some people grew up completely surrounded by slavery and the excuses made for slavery. They were never part of any movement, and they had to make the decision as isolated individuals that they were not going to support that institution, and they were going to do something to oppose it, to overturn it, to open up the road to a better future, to a better tomorrow for us all. I read a few pages of an autobiography. I didn't read that much of it because it was quite boring. Autobiography of a black woman who, in the days of slavery, was raised as a sort of experiment by white people who felt powerless in opposing slavery and decided that they would raise some black children as if they were white, with all the benefits of education and just kind of food, shelter, and clothing. And they would see if it were possible, in fact, for black people to be intellectually equal to white people. Hashtag spoilers. This woman in her autobiography was describing that when she first started publishing articles, later she moved on to writing and publishing books, the most common response was of denial, was of white people claiming that this was impossible. White people insisting, because they needed it for their own sense of moral certainty. They needed to believe that black people were incapable of this kind of intellectual development, erudition, incapable of responding to education, that black people were, by their biological nature, doomed to be nothing more than beasts of burden exploited by the slave system. The most common response was of white people insisting, no, that's impossible. It must be that one of these pious white Christians, some preacher, is, ghostwriting her material, and then she's pretending it's hers. And as I recall, some kind of visit from a journalist was arranged or something. Somebody came to independently verify that, yes, she could read and she could write, that she was the person producing these articles. Okay, you might think it's symbolic. You might think it doesn't matter at all for one family of white people to adopt and raise, one or two black children as their own and to treat them as equal and say, hey, within our tiny little society, within the society of this household, this family, we're going to treat black people as equal to whites. And we're going to prove that it can be done on that smallest scale. One man, one woman, one child. And you know what I have to say to you? I think that was one of the most powerful political gestures anyone ever could have accomplished in the struggle against slavery. This guy, while he was a vegan, he may have been one of the most brilliant and insightful people in the movement. I've spent so many years talking to fucking idiots who are leaders in this movement. People who have had money and fame and privilege handed to them by the vegan movement. People who never thought it through as much as this guy Tucker did. So Tucker, I don't flatter anyone. And I don't set up my criticism of other people by saying, 5 or 6 complimentary things to give sort of flattering context to it when I stick the knife in and tell them what a fucking idiot they are. I don't play that way. All right? I can say sincerely, Tucker, you were involved in the vegan movement for 4 years. Well, guess what? You had more insight into the movement, more understanding. You seem to really be much more brilliant than people who were in the movement for 20 years, 40 years, and who are still fucking sleepwalking. All right? You obviously understood the strengths and weaknesses of veganism far better than some of the most influential players in the game ever have or ever will. So I'm sorry to see you go. And your cynicism, the movement needs it. The movement doesn't need more bikini models. Movement doesn't need more bodybuilders. It needs more people like you. It needs more people who can point out what's wrong and what's hopeless about the vegan movement. But your problem is, Tucker, you appear to be a computer programmer. And you seem to be a victim of a problem many computer programmers have, which is that you think that by understanding a problem in principle, you understand it absolutely. And with social and political problems, it's not enough to understand rules. It's not enough to understand generalizations, principles. You have to understand a whole constellation of mutually contradictory and contrasting examples. All right? You say that one man alone can't change the world, that just one person being vegan is merely symbolic. Okay? One person can make a difference in opposing slavery. All right? One person did. Voltaire. With nothing but a pen. With nothing but a pen and a piece of paper. Frankly, no particular literary talent. The quality of his writing is abysmal. All right? Voltaire changed the world. And he challenged one of the most cruel, one of the most barbaric, but also one of the most profitable industries in the world when he took on slavery with nothing but satire. Now, here's what I want to ask you. If you had never met anyone who was vegan before in your fucking life, if you were completely alone, if you didn't even really have the concept of veganism or the word, do you think you could be brilliant enough to figure it out? Do you think you could take a look at how the slaughterhouses operate, the ecological consequences, the evidence, whatever you want to say? Do you think you could put the pieces together without ever having met a vegan, without ever having heard the word, without knowing any of the propaganda? Do you think that you could come to the conclusion that you alone should do what those people did in their isolated, desperate stand, taking a stand against slavery, not being part of an abolitionist movement, not having an organization or money behind you, and not even having a social circle of 10 to 20 cheerleaders to pat you on the back or make you feel good about yourself? Do you think you could be a vegan if veganism didn't exist, if it never had existed, and you were starting from a blank sheet of paper? Well, my answer to you is yes, you can. And a guy like you can do better than Gary Yourofsky ever did. You can do better than Gary Francione ever did. You can do better than all the bullshit artists who have milked this movement for money and fame. And in 2022, the game ain't over yet. You still can.